Oye, Kopeng, and welcome to Milowda de Expanse, Doof Media's dive into James S.A. Corey's The Expanse book series. I'm Elliot Diebold.
And I'm Reuben Morehouse.
And this is a pilot for a new show that we're running as part of our pilot season.
Yes, if you like this show and want to see it continue, leave your feedback on this pilot using the form that we've linked down in the show notes below.
Yeah, that forms one of the main metrics we're using to decide which show to go ahead with from the wide selection of pilot season shows.
The 8 pilots that we've almost finished doing, with this being the penultimate one.
Anyway, so with all that said, should we get straight into it?
Yeah, let's get into it. Tell us, Elliot, what is this first 7 chapters of this book?
Yeah, so it's like 8 if you include the prologue. We're going up till the end of chapter 7 of Leviathan Wakes, the first book.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we start with the prologue, as you would expect. And
Good place to start. That would come later.
And we step into the mind of Julie Andromeda Mao, who has spent 8 days stuck in a locker after her ship was boarded and hostilely taken over. And I actually just want to read out the opening line because I do this a lot in all of our things, but I just really love this one. So the book opens with, "The scopuli had been taken 8 days ago, and Julie Mao was finally ready to be shot."
Yeah, it's a good opening line, isn't it?
It hooks you in so well. I immediately, every time I read this, it's like, wow, that's but why? It's a good mystery to be like, why would somebody want to be shot?
Yeah.
Simple but effective.
Yeah, and the kind of framing device for the prologue is we go through the days that Julie has spent. So the first day, a bit of what happened, and then basically what has happened on each of the 8 days that she's been trapped inside this locker. And it basically just breaks her down. We get to see her break down until eventually we get to day 8 and she's ready to just be shot. She would rather be shot than stay inside that locker.
Yeah.
And then it gets worse.
Yes, there's all good stories too. And I think part of the reason this prologue works so well for me is because it's not just it's very Julie focused. As you said, we basically track these 8 days as we watch Julie go from someone who's fine to someone who's ready to kick open a locker and get shot for it. But they also, the story already starts to creep in some of this, scientific realism that kind of defines a lot of it. There's so much detail put into, the way she's getting water while she's in this locker and stuff. There's that attention to detail and those little things about when the gravity turns on and off that are already giving you a glimpse as to some of the stuff this series is going to, really pay attention to as it goes on.
Yeah, it really does set up the kind of detail-oriented nature of James's writing.
Yes. I mean, it's obviously just in case anyone somehow doesn't know, James S.A. Corey is the pen name of Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham, who,
2 people writing one book.
Write the books together, yes.
What do they, both hold the pencil at the same time?
No, they share a keyboard, like that scene.
Like in NCIS.
Yes.
Was it NCIS?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think
knew
it was.
What you were talking about, of course, the classic scene.
Anyway.
So one of them wrote, we'll get into this in a bit, but the chapters are from different perspectives, and one of them wrote one of the POV characters and the other one wrote the other, right?
Daniel, I believe, wrote the Miller chapters and Ty wrote the Holden chapters. And then obviously, they traded them and proofread them and kept it in sync.
Who wrote the prologue?
That just came about by itself.
It just spawned fully fleshed out. Fair enough. We kind of are going over Julie's thing. I think it's so bleak. That's the thing that really jumps out to me, right? Is it's such a bleak start, and we see this prologue character, and they start out being kind of you get the sense that she's a bit fierce, she kind of fights back with the crew.
Yeah, I think it's I think she goes over when they're first captured how the reason she's in this locker is because she fought back because she has a history of, I think she calls it low gravity jujitsu, which again, great little bit of world building. And even when she comes out of the locker after 8 days, I think there's a line where she comes up with her arms raised, either to look threatening or in the form of surrender, depending on whichever she thinks is going to be useful as she comes out. So you get the sense, she's ready to have a go if somebody wants to fight her, but as you said, it's bleak and she's just been broken down.
Yeah, she's endearingly scrappy, right?
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, anyway, so we recap those 8 days. She manages to break out of the locker, and basically, instead of finding anyone who's going to fight her, she just finds the places have seemingly been abandoned. She can't find anyone, so she heads down to the engineering deck to see about, like, whether she can actually restart this ship and get somewhere to survive. And when she gets in there, there's like the ship's nuclear reactor has some weird mud on it, and as she's kind of going to check out what the hell that mud is, there's a giant lump that comes across, and it's the head of the former ship of the captain, melded into the mud, and the head says, "Help me."
Yes. Great. So not only was Julie Mao, kind of abused and then locked in a locker for 8 days, she breaks out and runs into some kind of horrible flesh monster, which is presumably going to kill her or do something horrible to her. You don't really get to know what that is, but it's obviously not good.
I mean, it's asking for her help, so it might be friendly.
Oh yeah, of course, and that always goes so well in these situations.
Yeah, but like, no, I love this as well. We already talked about the opening line, but as a closing line, the final line is, I think, "Help me," the head said, or something, and you just sort of left sitting there like, what? And that's just the end. It's a great teaser.
Yeah, I mean, it is like a horror film, right? Like that's kind of the genre that this spaceship exists in. So yeah, it's obviously not going to be good, whatever it is. But what an opener! I loved it. It was great.
Yeah, it hooks you right in. I think this is a very effective prologue. I know the nature of prologues has been discussed a fair bit on the Doof Network recently, but I think this is a very good one.
Fair enough.
And so then we move into our first chapter proper, and this is from the perspective of James Holden, who is the XO, which is like second in command, of the Canterbury, a ship that transports ice from the moons of Saturn and brings it into the asteroid belt where a lot of people live.
It took me so long to realize what XO meant. I was so confused by it, and then I realized someone called him the executive officer at one point. I was like, oh, okay, that's what it's short for. So the job of the ship is basically the thing that they do in Futurama, where they have to bring ice in to stop global warming, which is a good job. It's a noble job. So
I think this ice is actually just for drinking, mostly, I guess. Oh, and toilets and stuff. But yeah, you're right. Like, it's such a... I think it's a really good idea to have, like, a main character whose job is just to bring ice in, because the concept of having to, like, import water is like really sort of sets the stage for the series that we're going to see in a bit. But yeah, basically, so as you brought up with the executive officer thing, the ship is kind of run pretty similar to how, like, nautical ships are run these days and have historically been run. And this chapter kind of spends half of its time establishing Holden as a character, and then the other half kind of introducing us to the solar system that this series is set in, giving us like, the core politics and structures of the, what is now a solar system-wide civilization.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to, or at least I didn't feel like it dove too deep into the kind of political situation. I think the next chapter goes a bit more into that, but it really does set up, like, here are some of the planets, or not even in a way that they're going to be important theoretically, just as like a, look, we are now a spacefaring civilization.
It's very broad strokes is how I describe it. Like, it's like there's Mars, there's Earth, there's, the belt. Some people are out on, one of the moons of Uranus now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's done in a quite clever way, because the prologue and then the first two chapters kind of represent these lenses that are slowly zooming in on the kind of political situation and the nature of the planets, right? And Holden's story, at least in these first few chapters of his that we see, doesn't actually you don't really need to know the politics of the situation, because the impacts of what happens in Holden's story, you feel the politics through Miller's story, where the politics are very relevant. So it's quite nice that it kind of takes this zooming in lens. It doesn't give you too much information to bog you down, as a lot of, I think, science fiction does tend to do. It just gives you enough so that you know what you need to. It gives you a little bit of, like, driplets of info about, there's a Mormon spaceship that's going to sail out into the world endlessly. Stuff like that.
Yeah, and again, like, I think one of the things they do is almost all these examples in the Holden chapter especially tie into what's happening at the time. Like, it's not just an exposition dump exclusively. It maybe drags on a little bit more than it would halfway through the book, but...
Yes, of course, you kind of need to.
Yeah, like, you need to do a bit of exposition, like, front-loading, but it's usually James ruminating on something in his head, and so they give you just enough that you can be like, okay, like, I see why that's relevant to what James is thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
But yeah, should we talk about Holden himself? Because obviously, I think he's the meat of the chapter. Really,
yes.
Teaching us about what he's like.
To him and his relationships.
Yeah. So I guess, what are your thoughts so far?
God, it's hard for me not to talk about him just in contrast to Miller. We'll get to that a bit later, I think. But I do, on the whole, quite like him. I think he's a bit of a kind of goody two-shoes type, which is fine. I don't know. I like him. I do find him... I'm going to do it. I'm going to make the comparison. I do find him slightly more boring than Miller because he's a bit of he feels kind of reactive to the situations that he's in. He's a bit of a kind of softly pushes for the things that he wants, but things don't really go his way, and he kind of floats along with life a little bit. And when he does break the mold of that, which we'll get to a little bit later, I feel like it doesn't do it very well.
Yeah, I think I know what you're getting at. We'll definitely talk about that.
Yes, we'll touch to that. I didn't dislike him, for sure, but I did find him, like, I actually thought the strength of this chapter was he seems like the kind of person that's really good at working with all of his crew. His crew are all very interesting, compelling characters, and he kind of brings out the best in them, which I think is what makes him a good leader. I think it makes him a good focused character because it means we get to see all of the characters that he interacts with in a lot of interesting depth, but I don't think it makes him a good, like, narrator kind of character,
Yeah, I agree. Like, there's definitely a bunch of moments in this first chapter where it's like you can tell one of his strengths is, I guess, like, reading other people or knowing what to do, how to interact with them to get the best out of them, like you said. Like, he's got that interaction with Naomi, where he pretty much knows he just needs to tell her, like, do whatever you think is best. But I think the best one is when Captain McDowell calls him in, and they do that sort of song and dance where Holden, has to pretend that it's like, he's like, oh, we have to go. And, they sort of set that thing up.
He has to pretend to be the stickler for the rules because that's clearly what he thinks McDowell is signaling, which seems to be correct. Like, he seems to get a very good read on this. He understands his place. He understands everything. He's clearly quite a nice guy and quite a personable guy. So I like him. Just, I think he's a bit, a bit milquetoast.
Yeah, and I again, like, another example that I think comes up with that in this chapter is the whole thing with Ade, his
yes.
She's essentially his fuck buddy at the moment.
Yes.
And he's the one who's really pushing for that to go to, like, full relationship, and she's the one saying that's not what I want. So it sets him up as a bit of a, like, hopeless romantic, I guess. Yeah,
and I think the thing that really, like, that would be fine in isolation, but Ade, the point that she makes is no, this is just meant to be a kind of fling situation because you clearly are in your element here and I am not going to be here for a long time. So it's like, this shouldn't be, like, we shouldn't get too invested, which I think is it's a relatively mature response from her, a mature set of thoughts. And I think Ade is correct on this, and Holden kind of doesn't accept it. Like, he inherently rejects it a little bit, even though I think it's correct. And so, again, it's, to me, this kind of thing of, like, he just a little bit too much doesn't know what's going on, He's, like, a little bit too naive. Yeah. Not a huge amount, just enough to make it kind of stand out.
No, I think that's a fair, like, read based on everything that's just happened. And so then I guess one other thing I quickly want to bring up as we start to move on from this chapter is I love the prose of this book series so much. Yeah. I really had to hold myself back from just pulling out constant quotes that didn't really have anything for me to say about them except, oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
So I've limited myself to one per chapter, and this is this chapter's.
Well, before you read this one, we should mention it is, like, the start of this chapter as well, right? It's the first part of this chapter. So it didn't take you long before you pulled out something that you really liked.
No, this is only about a paragraph in. So Holden's kind of recounting the broad strokes history of how humanity got to where it is. And he notes that Solomon Epstein had built his little modified fusion drive, popped it on the back of his 3-man yacht, and turned it on. With a good scope, you could still see the ship going at a marginal percentage of the speed of light, heading out into the big empty. The best, longest funeral in the history of mankind. Fortunately, he'd left the plans on his home computer.
It's so good. It's, the function of this from a perspective is telling us, hey, this is the invention that's kind of allowed this kind of travel, and that's really defined a lot of the world, blah, blah, blah. And yes, that's obviously important information that needs to be imparted. But the way it's done is in such a human way of of course, this engineer tested it and accidentally blew himself up, and his ship is now sailing off forever. And that's just it's just a great human, funny, interesting way of introducing these bits of information that are important to know for the world building. It kind of demonstrates the strength of the writing.
Yeah, and again, I think we're getting subtle characterization of Holden in that. The best, longest funeral in the history of mankind is a very, naive, hopeless, romantic Holden thing to think. Whereas you can tell Miller would just be tearing this guy to shreds in his narration.
He is, Holden is, he likes to be a little bit theatric. You can kind of already tell, because his, in this role with, in this interaction with the Captain McDowell, he is kind of he is acting a part, right? And you can tell that he kind of sees his function as in a lot of ways to kind of play the parts that he needs to play to get the best out of his crew.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, I want to kind of touch on the idea that we learn about the world a bit, and we learn that right when Epstein built the Epstein drive, or almost built the Epstein drive.
I mean, he built it. He just didn't survive.
I mean, he built version 1 of it, I suppose. There was going to be a war between Earth and Mars because they had expanded to the inner planets, and we just got to the point where we'd run out of space, and this war isn't resolved; it's deferred, right? Because the Epstein drive means, okay, now we can access a whole new region of space. And so we spread out to that. And now we're in this point where these factions have sprung up, and there was this seed of a war that was never resolved. And you can kind of tell that this is laying the groundwork for these places still have this feeling of being at war or about to be at war between them that never had any actual resolution. It was just kind of put off until later. And that's the kind of seed of the political world that we step into.
It still feels like a little bit of a Cold War, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or if not, maybe it didn't always feel like that, but it was that at one point, and then it kind of was deferred for a bit, but now we're getting to the point where resources are starting to slim out a bit. We're starting to slide back towards where we were 150 years ago when Earth and Mars almost went to war.
Yes. All you need is some Archduke to get assassinated, and things could really hit the fan. And so speaking of, the Canterbury, the ship that they're on, gets, picks up an emergency broadcast signal. And it is, they're obligated to go check it out by the nautical code of space. So that they head off to do so. And, the beacon is coming from the Scopuli, which of course was the ship that Julie was on in the prologue. So of course we're immediately like, there's probably nothing there.
Yeah. I think well, I'm not even just going to say this chapter. The entirety of this first set of the book is building up tension for what's going to happen. The first two, I guess the next Holden chapter, we'll talk about this more, but it really is all about these cliffhangers that build up the escalating tension that goes on throughout this book. Finding out, we get this point where the captain tells them to go check it out and basically says, hey, if anything goes wrong, come back quickly. And we kind of immediately know, James S.A. Corey is hanging a lampshade on this going wrong. Obviously, it's going to go wrong because we're in a book and it's a deserted spaceship, which is the #1 spooky thing out in space. And then, of course, we learn that it's the Scopuli, and it's oh yeah, this is actually just a horror movie plot that's being unfolding right out in front of us right now.
Yeah. So as you sort of said, that sort of cliffhanger that they're about to go look at the Scopuli leads us into chapter 2, where we completely leave that all behind for now, and we jump into the head of Miller, who is our detective working on the asteroid Ceres station. So this asteroid has been spun up, so it has a bit of artificial gravity, and now has like 6 million people living on it.
Yeah, a pretty good, sizable asteroid. And yeah, so we get into Miller's perspective, which is more of and it's not fully noir, but it is kind of space cowboy detective style, right?
Yeah, absolutely. He's, he's a detective on paper, and that plays into it all a bit for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, this chapter I feel like is sort of doing two things again. Like on the one hand, it's introducing us to Miller and Havelock as well, I guess. But it's also obviously putting in a lot more work, really establishing the sort of third party in the solar system. We talked a lot about Earth versus Mars in chapter 1. Now we're diving a lot more into the belt and the people who are now living on the fringes of society in more ways than one.
Yep, the Belters. So yeah, and the way this chapter starts off is with a bit of Belter patois, right? Similarly to how this episode started. And it really does, feel alien. Like immediately it's like, oh, this is something that I know about 80% of, but the 20% that I don't know is just, I literally could not guess what it means. And it's a great way to start us off because it immediately sells to us, us being humans in the audience, that the Belters are different. That there is a cultural divide between us, humans, and Belters. I mean, I say humans. Obviously, Belters are humans, but you know what I mean. What do they call them? Gravity children.
Well wallers, Milowdas. Yeah, there's a bunch of terms for them.
Yeah, exactly.
None of them polite. But yeah, no, I agree. And I think, basically Havelock is there kind of working as the audience surrogate a bit, because they sort of leave and Havelock's like, so what the fuck was
going on? Yeah, exactly.
which is obviously great for us, the readers, because as you said, the first time you're reading it, you're like, what is this?
Yes. No, it's great. And going back, you hear the Miller's explanations of the like 2 or 3 phrases that Havelock hasn't heard before. And you go back and you're like, oh yeah, that does make sense. Like I can kind of follow the flow of the conversation now. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's good stuff. It again, introducing us to more of the stuff in the world, but in a way that feels natural, kind of human, and is a lot more interesting than just kind of learning about this in a more clinical way.
Yeah. And so let's talk about the Miller that we're introduced to in this chapter. Because I guess I would describe him, there's this whole beat where they sort of talk about how he's good at poker but not good at team sports. I think that's what Miller thinks to himself. And I think that's sort of establishing him as a bit of a loner, I guess.
Yeah, I want to pull out the quote of what it is, because Miller doesn't just think that he's a loner. He thinks about how Havelock isn't good at bluffing or hiding how he's feeling, so he'd be really bad at poker. And then he thinks Miller was good at poker. And that's played with again later when he thinks about how Havelock has a thick skin, is able to laugh at his own expense. And so, he'd be good at like team activities like team sport, blah, blah, blah. Miller wasn't good at those things. Yeah. And it's not explicitly saying, Miller's a loner, Miller's good at bluffing, Miller's bad at social interactions. But it's kind of Miller being able to reflect on Havelock, and then that characterizes him to us based on these kind of little implications that are made.
Yeah, you're right. It's really clever, and it, makes you feel like a detective for putting it together.
It's an easy case, but still one worth solving.
Yes, yeah. I think the other thing as well is we quickly catch on to the fact that, unlike Holden, Miller does not think that the world is sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah.
He mentions this joke that exists, which is Ceres doesn't have laws; it has police. And then goes on to sort of say sometimes people fall out of airlocks, sometimes evidence vanishes from the lockers. It wasn't so much that it was right or wrong, as long as it was justified.
Mm.
And there's another quote, I think, earlier where he says, the good thing about organized crime is that it's organized.
Yeah.
So, he's not setting himself up to be, someone who's always fighting for the side of the good of the law or anything, I suppose.
Yes. The impression that I got from this first chapter of Miller's is he's like a cog in a system, He sees this system, this ecosystem of criminals and police, in air quotes on Ceres, and he's kind of fully aware of it and kind of leans into his role in it. And he's not heroic. At least you don't get that picture from this first chapter. He kind of just like wants to play his role in the system. And I can totally see there's a situation where if Miller had different circumstances growing up or whatever, he would just totally be like on the organized crime side, and he'd have the exact same philosophy, and it would be basically the same character.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think
I
later
really like
chapters
that.
change that notion to me, because we do see that he has a heart, but at the start it very much is about there's a ecosystem here, and Miller at least really gives the impression of, I'm a part of this ecosystem, and that's how I like it.
Yeah, and he's not going to follow the letter of the law. Like, to, he's going to do. He's willing to go off book if he needs to, I think, is sort of what it implies to me when he's saying, evidence vanishes, people fall out of airlocks. Like, who cares?
Yes, he's willing to go off book, but the impression I get is he's willing to go off book because that's just kind of the way it's done around here,
Right, yeah. And then, obviously, I think we spent a bit of time with Havelock as well in this chapter, and the upcoming ones. So I guess I wanted to get your impression of him as well, because, he comes across as maybe a bit of a schmuck in this chapter.
I can see that. I don't feel like it's him being a schmuck. I think it's just he is so out of place here, right? Like, we talk about Miller recognizing and enjoying or leaning into his part in the ecosystem, and Havelock just doesn't. Havelock doesn't fit into this ecosystem. He totally is a square peg in a round hole. Like, he doesn't fit in with the Belters. He doesn't want to kind of go along with the grey morality, which seems to be how this society runs on series. He just is so out of his element.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Like, he's a localized schmuck.
It's not inherently him. It's just he's just not in the right place. And we get so many beats of Miller in this chapter and later on just being like, I mean, Havelock, what did you expect? Like, why are you here? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I guess. Yeah. We'll talk about that a bit more as we go into the other chapters.
Yes. Chapter 4, I think we'll talk more about Havelock as he collapses a bit.
Yeah. So I guess let's talk a bit more about the Belters, because obviously Miller himself is a Belter, and this chapter really starts to dive into the Belters and how they're not the same as people on Earth. And I mean, right from the get-go, I don't think this book is shying away from the metaphor it's building here. One of the first things Miller says to Havelock is about the Belter Creole that we heard before. Is he saying that wasn't Belters keeping the Earth guy out, that was poor folks keeping the educated guy out. And I mean, that's I think that's pretty explicitly addressing the metaphor that the book is really setting up here, which is, the Belters are this sort of lower working class. They're out on the fringes. They're living by the skin of their teeth to provide resources for the inners. And they're understandably not impressed with the current political landscape.
Yeah, they are quite clearly the oppressed class here, and it's. Yeah, I guess that's the real function of Havelock here, is to demonstrate to us, like, this isn't about any kind of prejudice in terms of the fact that they're thin or look slightly different or anything. Because Havelock isn't a super privileged guy. He kind of just stands out because he's not part of the class that they have here. Of like, they've literally been kind of molded to survive in the parts that are the offcuts that no one else really wants, and that just divides them.
Yeah, and as you say, it's that classic thing where in sci-fi and fantasy, you get to take these metaphors and maybe make them a bit more literal. So you've got this class divide, which is now manifesting itself as a very physical difference between the Belters and the Earthers. Belters are much taller and skinnier, and that physical difference obviously makes it much easier for people to discriminate based on sight, because you can look at someone and say they're an Earther and immediately come to judgments based on stereotypes about that, and it's going the same thing the other way.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting to me because, well, here's the thing. As I was reading this, I kind of went through as we were learning more about the Belters, and this kind of applies going forward as well. The Belter culture that we see here, well, I'm thinking back to the crew of the Canterbury, and trying to think. And I'm pretty sure the only one that we know is a belter is Naomi. Is that right?
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
And it's interesting to me to compare the idea of belter culture that we get here with the picture of Naomi that we get. And I'm trying to kind of reconcile those two things because it is, it is a completely different world, basically, between Miller and Havelock on series. Whereas for Naomi, who's a belter that, travels around with Earthers and Martians, right? It's there's almost no divide at all.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess we'll have to track, how that goes throughout the rest of the story, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm just kind of interested to see the way Naomi interacts with other belters and the kind of way that she interacts with belter culture. Because it's something that was interesting to me and kind of I pulled it out of Miller defines belter culture so specifically and so like viscerally here and throughout later chapters. But it seems to be something that, as far as I can tell so far, is potentially localized to series or just like the belters that live on these planets as opposed to the ones who travel throughout space. It's maybe not as big of a deal for them.
I guess the other thing is so far, we're only seeing Naomi through Holden's perspective, and he may not necessarily be the most aware of
that's fair.
What she's going through in that regard.
Yeah.
Like we could talk about that a bit later, actually. There's a good example of that, but I also think just one last thing to quickly mention in this chapter. I love Miller has a quote where he's thinking about like inners, people from Earth and Mars, and he thinks living on the surface of a planet, mass sucking at every bone and muscle, and nothing but gravity to keep your air in close seemed like a fast path to crazy. And like I love this as starting to highlight just the differences in the way belters think, because you read that as someone living in the 21st century now, and you're like, no, living in a little tube out in the middle of nowhere, spinning on a rock that's trying to throw you off, that's the crazy. Yeah. So it's really like helping, like immediately just sort of like, wow, these people just think in a very different way to us.
Yeah, I guess the fact that they have like these multiple systems that are needed to keep them alive out here, it kind of leads them to be almost inherently defensive, right? They're kind of turtled away in their little space station. Well, not little, but you know what I mean.
No, like again, that makes sense to me. Like, if you were reliant on like external sources of water and air to keep you alive, that would make you tetchy.
Yeah, fair enough.
But again, that's something that comes up later.
Yeah.
So I guess we also this chapter starts to touch on the OPA, which are some sort of belter organization that Miller describes as part social movement, part wannabe nation, and part terrorist network. So there's some sort of extremist belter liberation group from the seams of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me. They are framed as somewhere between the line of like a social movement and a terrorist organization, right? But the only tangible thing that we know about them beyond this is this character. I mean, we'll get to this in a second, but Julie has joined up with a faction of them, basically, as a kind of as a human rights activist, basically.
Yeah, and because that's basically where this chapter leaves off, is as Miller sort of teaches us a bit about the OPA. We learn that Julie is associated with them, and in fact, Miller's new job, his new case, is to find Julie and send her back to her parents, who have requested that she, they describe it as a kidnap job, because that's kind of what it is.
It's 100% what it is. It takes someone who doesn't want to go back home and put them on a ship back home. I think he explicitly says in a later chapter, like, tied up on a ship back home.
Yeah, exactly. And so, of course, again, we leave this second chapter also directly tying Miller to this overarching plot we're clearly forming around Julie and her ship.
Good parenting, by the way. Hiring somebody to kidnap your daughter and bring her home.
I mean, well, if she's joined a terrorist organization.
Well, is it a terrorist organization, though? Because the other bit we get here is Miller thinks, what side would Captain Shadid, his commanding officer, whatever, his captain, his police chief, be on if there was an OPA attack? Like, he doesn't fully believe that she would be on the side of the law, in air quotes. And that indicates to me there's more going on with the OPA than just labeling them as a terrorist organization would suggest at first glance.
Yeah, I guess we'll see if they come up. I mean, they will.
Yeah.
Obviously, Julie's associated with them to some degree.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, Miller's an interesting character. I quite like him so far. He's hard to get a beat on. He's got some weird, sketchy things because he lives in a weird, sketchy place, right? Things like he's kind of not fantasizing, but like imagining his ex-wife constantly.
Yes, yeah. He does that a bit more in some of the later chapters, but it's a bit like
Yes.
you kind of like, okay, so what's going on here?
Yeah, but then kind of the counter to that is he does seem to have this like intuition about this ecosystem that he's been a part of for so long on series of he just kind of senses that things are kind of going a little weird, which seems to be very accurate based on how later chapters unlock.
Yeah, in fact, because you're right, that is something I sort of glossed over. Is what happens before he gets assigned the Julie case is he's noticing this pattern where the local organized crime people, some of their people are getting taken out and they're not responding, and that's very odd. Where they should be protecting their territory more voraciously, but they're not for some reason.
Yeah, exactly. It's this kind of like detective's hunch that makes him quite likable in the fact that he just kind of has a nose for something going wrong.
Yeah, yeah. But yes, and so that ends chapter 2, and now we head back to Holden for chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
So the mission to go and look at the Scopuli is leaving. Holden is leaving. Holden is leading a small team. He's got Shed, the medic we met in chapter 1, in case anyone is still alive on board. Naomi and Amos are coming in case there isn't, but there's stuff worth stealing. And then lastly, we get the pilot, who is Alex Kamal.
Yeah. Yeah, a good little crew. You don't immediately know that they're going to be the most important crew members on the Canterbury, but that we'll find about that later. I think the thing I really liked was the little backstory that we got on Alex's accent, because he talks in this like Texan drawl, like he's a cowboy. And the detail that Holden goes into, that the place on Mars that Alex is from was mostly settled by Eastern Indian, of which I think Alex is.
Yes, yeah.
And Chinese folks and a small amount of Texans, and somehow the Texan accent kind of won out there, and and now everyone like from that part of Mars talks like a Texan, which is again like vivid and evocative and sets up more of the like space western kind of vibe that these books start to slide into, while giving us a very funny and I guess realistic explanation for how that happened.
Yeah, you're right. It just personalizes like this huge chunk of Mars that it's a bunch of people who I think he describes it as the Texan drawl being infectious. And so now you're just picturing this melting pot of various cultures that all speak like Texans.
Yes.
Which is very fun. Yeah, I think there's a few other really good beats as the crew's getting ready. They've been in high G for a while now, and Holden notes like how much it's affecting him to be at high gravity. And I bring this up just because if we're establishing this sort of difference between the Belters and the Inners based on whether they grow up in gravity, if Holden's so affected by short stints in high gravity now, that maybe suggests he's starting to turn more one way than the other, like, leave his origins behind a bit, become a bit more Belter.
Yes, I don't think it's as simple as that, because I think the Belters are explicitly like injected with drugs that make them work better at low gravity. But I do like that he's kind of, he's on a ship that is really a melting pot of people from different factions, right? Well, I say factions, I guess just backgrounds. We've got a Belter, an Earther. I think Holden is an Earther and Amos is an Earther. Is that right? And Shed?
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And then Martian, Alex. And so it kind of, as we're starting to see, this story is going to start to talk about political consequences to some of the things that we're about to see across like the divide between these factions. And so I think it's great that the crew is from all these different factions, and Holden is someone who kind of represents a bit of all of them. He doesn't really fit into any of them very cleanly. So I think it's great to set them up as a kind of independent entity that is striding the line between all the different factions in this conflict.
Yeah, I like that. And then obviously I think the other thing that we establish here is something that came up in chapter 1 is the Knight, the shuttle that they're taking. Naomi spent half of chapter 1 sort of talking about how not in good shape it is, and like it's technically fine, but it's a great another little bit of tension that it's like, okay, so we know this ship is not at 100% working order. And,
great.
Yeah.
Luckily, we'll only be in it for a few hours.
yeah, of course. Yeah. So I don't know, do you have any other thoughts on this little crew? I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but obviously, they're going to be the important characters. I think we can say.
The rest of the crew on the Canterbury should be around for a while. I don't know. I don't get too much of a read from Amos or Shed so far. Like they don't. I don't think Amos even has. I mean, he has like 4 lines, I think, in the chapters.
Well, they're mostly like just backing people up or agreeing with them.
Yeah. Alex and Naomi, we get more of a beat on. I actually like Naomi's a great character. I really like her. She's like if Holden was more competent, which is great. So that's fun. Alex, I don't think I have too much of a read on, but I do love that he has a Texan drawl, so it kind of sticks in your head.
Yeah, I completely agree. So our motley crew sort of reach the Scopuli.
Yep.
And things are a bit weird. There's breaching charges on the side, which doesn't really make any sense because you can't sneak up on people in space yet.
For these few chapters.
There's no bodies, which like Holden begins to think is actually creepier than if there were. So they head down to the engineering deck and it's completely empty.
Yeah, so it was the engineering deck where the flesh monster was before, right?
Yes.
Okay. So it's not here now. So something very spooky is going on, right? Like I can picture the TV adaptation, I guess. I was going to say the movie, but then I was like, oh, wait. Like I can picture the TV adaptation having this moment of, we've seen Julie Mao approach this one part of the ship and then she turned the corner and there's a flesh monster and Holden's approaching the same part and he turns the corner and the strings start to play and then there's nothing and you're just kind of like, oh, is that better or worse?
Yeah, exactly. Which is a bit of a running theme as they explore this ship. Where they keep finding things, and it's like, oh, that's not what I expected, but I don't know if it's better.
Yeah, is that good? Yeah, exactly.
And so eventually they find this set of strange devices that it turns out are actually what's emitting the emergency broadcast, not the beacon from the actual ship. And
which again, like what?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's basically when Holden's like, okay, this makes no sense. I was told to leave if anything seems off. We're leaving.
Yeah, it took him a while, to be honest. I mean, there were a few opportunities that he could have done this. And he's kind of... There's this beat where he keeps thinking of what Captain McDowell said to him before they left, which is, if you see anything out there that seems off, don't play hero again. I love that it's again, by the way.
Yeah.
Just pack up the toys and come home. And he thinks this, every time he sees something weird, he thinks this, and then he thinks... No, it's probably fine. I'll just keep going. Until finally he eventually turns around, and by this point it's too late. So, whoops.
Yes. But what I love about this is you're expecting the shit to hit the fan for them because he and Amos start to think, oh, what if there's a second thing? What if this is meant to send a second signal when we find it? And then as soon as they think that, they actually get the notification back from the Canterbury. Everyone else is there who... Captain McDowell radios in and says, we might have a problem. Yeah. And, because basically every chapter in this book ends on a cliffhanger, that's where we finish up.
That's the end. Yeah, it's rough. And I think this chapter kind of reveals to us that there is more political Machiavellian plotting going on here, right? Because, someone must have left that emergency signal device there. Like, someone must have come to this ship, either like kidnapped or cleaned up the flesh monster and left this emergency thing, but not just like turned on the emergency beacon from the actual ship. So like obviously some weird shit is going on that takes a few steps of planning and intrigue. There's clearly some Machiavellian plotting happening here, basically, is what this chapter signals to me.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair read. I love how it just starts to unravel, and you like it's definitely at that point in the story where you're just asking more and more questions. And at least for me, this is the point where I start to even forget that there was a flesh monster in the prologue. I'm just getting wrapped up in the human conflict.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I guess there's a lot of threads to be tugged on, right? In this mystery, and so it kind of starts. I think it takes us down the political thread a lot, and we don't ever touch on the flesh monster thread again in these chapters. So we'll see. Maybe that flesh monster is just like out there chilling.
Yeah. And then to pull my chapterly quote that's semi-relevant. I love this quote that just sort of helps us set up how out of their element humanity kind of is in space. So Holden, when he first finds these beacon devices, he thinks they might be bombs. And so the quote from the book is, "His heart took a long pause between beats. He called out to Amos, 'Does that look like a bomb to you?' Amos ignored him. Holden turned his radio link back on, and then he repeats it again. But like, I just love that thing. You've got someone standing next to you. So your first thought is, why is he not? Wait, why is he ignoring me? And then there's that realization of, oh, I haven't turned my radio on. I mean, the current situation of the world, I've done the same thing on Skype within the last week. I've started talking and I've been like, why is nobody listening to me? I was muted the whole time.
Yeah, very relatable.
Yeah, it's just it's showing how out of their element everyone is in space.
Yeah, it's just a bit more disconnected and a bit more unfriendly out here.
Yep. In space, no one can hear you radio about bomb questions.
No one can hear you ask if that's a bomb.
Yes. So we enter chapter 4. We're jumping back to Miller, who's settling in for a nice dinner of fungal beans.
Yum yum.
Yes, when he gets a call from a bartender friend of his, basically saying that Havelock is drunk and looking for a fight with some belters. So Miller heads up to sort of calm him down and have a chat with him.
Yeah. So should we dive into Havelock a bit more?
Yeah, sure.
He's clearly spiraling here, and I think, like, Havelock, the solution to your problem, if I may, is you're clearly out of place here, Havelock. It's starting to go to shit anyway. Just leave. Just go somewhere else, man.
You do have to wonder what's keeping him here.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, like, I think what's fun about this as well is the backdrop of this chapter is very much like some more day-to-day things that are unique to the Belters. Like I already mentioned, the fungal beans. Miller sort of talks about how most beer on Sirius is light beer just because of the way the cultures have to be grown.
Yeah.
The chapter 2 taught us a lot about sort of Belters and their political stance. There's a much more like, this is what a day in the life of a Belter looks like and how it's different to, like a life here on Earth.
Yeah, it really does bring out more of the just, everything's a little bit different here. And, you might not expect it coming in, but there's enough differences that they all stack up to quite an alien experience overall.
Yeah, and I think the highlight for me is there's a moment where Havelock tries to drunkenly storm off, but because he's used to Earth gravity, when he does that, he's kind of pushing down. He's stomping too hard, and so he's kind of hopping across the bar. And it's such a great comedy moment. Like you imagine this guy trying to be angrily leaving away, and he's just kind of hopping.
He can't even get that right.
It's hilarious.
Yeah. I want to pull out something from this chapter, which is, again, Miller is like constantly picturing his ex-wife in his head, like commenting on his actions. And I kind of love this because it's like, he must be such a lonely character, but the way he kind of gets around it is by basically imagining a kind of sitcom-esque wife, like the kind of wife you would have in an old 90s sitcom that's like, oh, you, and kind of hates her husband. And in this, it's his ex-wife. And almost certainly this is not what she's like at all, because they broke up. But she's just kind of like sarcastically condemning everything that he does.
Yeah, it's interesting how, like, it's often, when he's alone, he has this this version of Candace. And you're right, she's sort of commenting or deriding everything he's doing. It's, I don't know, it doesn't strike me as a particularly healthy thing.
Well, if I could, again, I'm sitting in my armchair psychoanalyzing here, but there's this scene when Miller is on the train, I think it is, and he has this interaction with a father and a little girl, and he kind of, the reaction I get to that is he's almost kind of like proving to his fictional, in his head, ex-wife, like, hey, see, look, I can be good with children, right? Which is potentially something that they broke up over. I'm reading very deeply into this, but like he's almost like arguing against this fictional version of her in his head of like, see, we didn't need to break up because I could be good with a 2-year-old, like I'm not inherently broken. And she's just kind of like sarcastically waggling her finger at him, and he's like, yeah, which doesn't seem super healthy. He's like hung up on the past in this sense, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah, and then obviously, like, to sort of bring it forward to what he's going through with Havelock, like, you know, he sort of gives Havelock the exact advice you've sort of been saying, which is he's just kind of saying to Havelock, you don't belong here.
Yeah.
You know, Shaddid is never going to like you.
Yeah.
He's basically in you know, without directly saying it, he's basically saying you should reconsider being here.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fair enough. Like, not just like obviously Shaddid and the other cops, you can kind of blame them for not getting along with him. But like, he's just never going to be able to do his job effectively because people just won't talk to him the same way that they'll talk to Miller or presumably other Belters.
Yeah, exactly. But on the flip side, I've talked a lot about how Miller's a bit of a loner and not the best person, but he seems to genuinely want the best for Havelock. He seems like he's a nice guy.
He actually does give you the impression that he's actually quite a kind person in this chapter. In contrast to what I was saying before, he could have been an organized criminal and it wouldn't be that different. He actually cares here, right? Like, it would be easy to get the impression that Miller feels like begrudged that he has to kind of take care of Havelock here, but he doesn't. He doesn't. He has this moment of being like, okay, he's my partner, I'll go help him, that's just how it works. But he doesn't begrudge Havelock for this. He kind of genuinely like takes care of him, and we never see him be like, hey, you owe me one or whatever later on, right?
Yeah, exactly.
He genuinely seems to sympathize for and care for Havelock and kind of relate to him feeling out of place a bit, which is nice. He's a kind person.
Yeah, exactly. Like he's interesting, right? Like there's a lot of depth to Miller. Which I really like.
Yeah, me too. I find him quite an interesting character so far.
Yeah, but then so Miller and Havelock just sort of start to get to the point where they're having a good time. They've moved to a cop bar because Miller wants to, quote, keep any fights in the family, which I like. And yeah, things seem to be going well when everyone's terminals go off. Terminals is just Expanse for smartphone, basically.
Yep.
And they get a message from Captain Shaddid that basically seems to imply shit's about to go off.
Yeah, everyone's phone rings at the exact same time, and that's never a good sign.
No, it's a very it's a big detective or cinematic cliche, I suppose.
Yeah.
So Captain Shaddid is like, I'm going to play for you the video that is about to set off like riots or whatever, and all we get to see of the video is some person coming on the screen and saying, "Hi, I'm James Holden." Yep. And then it just cuts off, and it's just a classic
cliffhanger, a classic way to set up. Wow, shit's really gone down more than we thought, because this is way more of a reaction than we expected anything to have, and we don't know what it's for, but we're going to find out because the chapter starts to change, and you're like, "Yep, all right, bring it on. What's going on?"
Yeah, I don't think you could physically put the book down between this Miller chapter and the upcoming chapter.
It's insane,
crazy. Yeah. So we enter chapter 5. We cut back to Holden, and basically he and his crew are, getting out of Dodge. They're leaving the Scopuli as quickly as they can.
Yep.
The Canterbury. So the problem was basically the Canterbury detected this very weak heat signature that, like, honestly sounds like it could just be like a gas cloud. Is there
like an error of the instruments or anything?
Yeah, exactly. But it was just enough for McDowell to be like, no, let's call this off. And I like this as like, we just talked about how we just got it established that there's about to be some real shit going down with Holden, and then we come back and it's just like, I don't know, we saw a gas cloud or something, so come back. Then it turns out they were probably right, because this weak heat signature turns into 6 ships that seem to have some kind of stealth tech. That's what that slight warmth they saw was. And these ships also fire a bunch of missiles at the Canterbury.
Yep. So immediately things get ratcheted up to 11. We kind of expected, I think, things to go badly on the Scopuli, but actually that was fine. Like, the things went shit out there, which is a nice little sleight of hand that I quite liked.
Yes. And I think this is our first real action chapter, and I want to talk about that because it feels like an action chapter, and you're tense in the way that you are for an action chapter.
Yeah.
They barely leave their chairs.
No,
for the whole
it's
chapter.
an action chapter that is just kind of countdowns, basically.
Yeah, it's like I really love this. It's like all this frantic like brainstorming, and there's this hopelessness. And as you said, like I think what really drives it is there's countdowns all over the shop for when we can do this, when we can do that.
Yeah,
and it's amazing how it creates this sense of like a really tense action scene, despite for the most, like, within the ships, no one's really moving. In fact, half of them are knocked out for most of it.
Yeah, not only are they not doing anything, they kind of can't do anything, right? Like,
yes.
Yeah, it's a situation where it's like, oh, we just kind of have to sit here and see what happens, and that's our only real action we can take right now.
Yeah, they spend most of it planning for what they're going to do after the pirates have disabled the Canterbury. Yeah. We also get introduced to the juice, which is this very fun concoction which can keep you awake during high G maneuvers when humans would normally pass out due to lack of blood flow.
Yeah, that's healthy.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's arguably not that much better than passing out, because basically what it does is just it's like a intense extra, like 2.0 version of an adrenaline shot. That's basically just designed to keep you so your blood so hyper pumping that you literally can't pass out. So it's not a fun experience. I just really like it as a device to kind of, we're talking about how tense it is in their chest. It's because literally their hearts are being fueled to pump like very hard and very fast.
Yeah. I like that, actually. I didn't make that connection of like they're literally being injected to make them more tense to match the tension of the scene, but I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and the description really sells it. Like the way Holden sort of mentions that, like, as they hit the high G and the juice kicks in, the nerves at the back of his eyeballs scream under the weight of his eyes. I mean, that's very vivid. That worked on me. I blinked a couple of times after reading that. I didn't like it.
Yeah, no, it's rough. It is kind of nauseating. It starts to set the stage for this being more horrific than you expect.
Yeah. So the Canterbury prepares to be disabled by the torpedoes and boarded by pirates.
Yep.
And that isn't quite what happens, because the torpedoes are a little bit more powerful than they were expecting. They were all nuclear, and so 6 nuclear charges go off, and the Canterbury is reduced to its component atoms.
Yes, it is completely vaporized, which is rough. It's obviously horrific, right? I want to talk about, though, the way Holden kind of feels during this chapter, because it's so, for an action chapter, as we've talked about, it's so impotent. Like it escalates or like degenerates, I guess, from first, okay, let's get back in time and we can help out. Okay, no, we're not going to get back in time. Let's like be ready so that we can help out afterwards. Oh, okay, maybe let's go on the other side and just kind of let people know that what's going on. The other side of this asteroid, so we're safe, and so we can kind of be a bargaining chip in this conflict. To eventually he goes under the juice and he can't even talk, right? He can interact by like clicking his radio, and that's it. And he's completely impotent and just listens as everyone dies, which is horrifying.
Yeah, the way he's like plugged into Arde's voice channel, so he hears this last gasp. Is heartbreaking.
Yes,
you're right. Like, it's an action chapter where they don't do anything, and in fact, they couldn't have done anything.
Yeah, it kind of defines itself by how impotent Holden is in this whole scene.
Yeah, more of a disaster chapter than an action chapter, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I guess, like, we've talked a bit about how Holden is very clued into everyone and getting the best out of them, and sort of talking around maybe he has some natural leadership skills, and he's forced to kind of step up as the captain now that McDowell and the rest of the Canterbury crew have passed.
Yeah.
And, I mean, he kind of blows it, right? Because his first act is to send pictures of all the dead people at the ships that are coming at them, which gets them like a warning laser painted on them as well.
Yeah.
Which is just like, it's just I think Naomi and the rest of the crew come up at this point. They're like, what are you doing?
It seems like a stupid move, but I actually think it worked out pretty well. Like, for them, that was fine. It was a bad decision, but it actually worked out. The worst decision is the next one that he makes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll get into that. Basically, after, the ships kind of give them a warning, hey, stop sending us pictures or we'll shoot you.
Yeah.
The ships all start to leave, leaving them, presumably to sit here and die.
Mm-hmm.
And Alex comes down and sort of mentions to Holden that this stealth tech is not like pirates don't have this. This is very high grade. Mars was actually working on it when Alex was in the Navy, which wasn't even that long ago. And if Mars has it, Earth probably does too, because that's how these sort of Cold War situations tend to work. So they pull apart the beacon that they've rescued from the Scopuli, and they find MCRN, which is the Mars Congressional Republic Navy, logos all inside the beacon. And so outraged, Holden broadcasts to the solar system all the evidence he has, because, the Canterbury's been blown up. Here's evidence that the MCRN was involved.
Yeah, but it's important to point out, like, the way that his broadcast starts is something like, I'm James Holden and my ship was destroyed by a Martian, whatever, right?
Yes, well, I mean, that's something that comes up a lot over the next few chapters is exactly how he phrased it.
It's such a stupid thing to do, like, because looking at this situation, and Holden has this thought, right? He has the thought of, why would they do this? Like, what possible reason is there to do this? And so he gets like 95% of the way through the chain of thought without finishing it off, which is obviously there's no reason to do this for piracy reasons. There's no reason for them to do it. Maybe one reason for them to do it is to prevent witnesses from something, from whatever happened to the Scopuli. Maybe that's a reason. Except they explicitly left Holden and his crew alive, right? So it can't be that.
Yeah.
So literally the only other thing that it could be is they want witnesses to something. They want witnesses to some atrocity, which is like starting a war 101, right? and Holden plays right into their hand by saying, oh yeah, you want people to know what happened here? Well, I'll tell everybody, and I'll tell them in the most, aggravating and likely to make them jump to conclusions way possible. Like, you can forgive him. He's not thinking clearly, obviously, but it's like, it's so clearly doing exactly what the people who just murdered all your friends want you to do, Holden.
Interesting. Because, at this point, we cut back to series, which is dealing with the aftermath of Holden's response. And as you say, it basically seems to be gearing up to start a war.
Yeah.
Miller and Havelock are racing back to prepare for the riots. And Havelock, it's this really interesting conversation where Havelock, and as you imagine, Holden as well, doesn't really comprehend the consequences of this broadcast. Like, Havelock has watched it and he's like, why is this going to start a war?
Yeah, I didn't even fully comprehend it, but the fact that it's an ice freighter is explained to us as so significant, and it makes sense after it's explained. But it's even more of like, Holden, even more so, it was a terrible idea. Like, what a mistake.
Yeah, exactly. So Miller sort of explains to Havelock that, Belters, through generations of living in a situation where the tiniest environmental problem can just kill everyone on your station or ship or whatever, they've basically been, trained to not take that shit at all. Like Miller talks about this example where basically the police were investigating a murder. They found out the guy was tortured and murdered because he fucked with the air filtration system, and so the whole police force was just like, well,
Case
nothing
closed.
to see here. Basically just giving that sort of behavior the okay. Like, in Belter culture, torturing and killing someone is perfectly fine if they're fucking with the environmental system, and it kind of makes sense given how important it is. It's really continuing to establish this kind of lawful neutral Miller. Like, I think we're starting to see this shape of him. Like, he wants to work for the greater good, and he doesn't necessarily believe that the law and the police are the way to do that every time. Like, they have a purpose. As you said, he's a cog in this machine, and sometimes the best way for him to do that is to be enforcing the law, and sometimes it's not, and he does whatever he thinks is servicing the greater good at the right time.
Yeah, I mean, kind of fair enough. There's clearly a pretty complex balance of organizations just on Ceres, not to mention the entire galaxy, and I kind of can respect Miller's perspective on this.
Yeah. And I love the way this whole conversation is framed, just how Belters just think differently to Earthers, and, Holden and Havelock just didn't quite get this, and it really frames it as this idea of, like, the poor versus the rich, like, just the way the Belters treasure these resources and their access to them so much more. Whereas if you've grown up where water falls out of the sky, is how Miller phrases it, which is just a way I've never thought about like rain before. It just frames that different way of thinking. Like they've had to buy and purchase every breath of air and every drop of water their whole life, so they think about it in a very different way.
Yeah. I mean, it's they never had the chance to take these things for granted, right? Yeah. It really, like, the first half of Miller's chapter here is basically saying to us as non-belters, no, it's even worse than you thought. Like, learn about how belters value all of these things, and then learn about how defensive they would be naturally, and then imagine this thing happening and see how bad it's actually going to get.
You're right, because Miller basically says, we will attack any threat to our environment systems, and Holden has basically gone on a public broadcast and say, Mars is blowing up ice haulers and threatening your water supply.
Yeah, which... Yeah, I mean, obviously it's bad. And even the first Miller chapter was basically setting up the idea that Sirius is a bit of a powder keg waiting for a spark to set it off. And again, I'm like, oh yeah, of course it's going to be terrible, because it's not only is it clearly intended to start a war, but these are the reasons that are going to make it even worse than we initially might have thought.
Yeah, you're right. This chapter's just throwing more on the pile.
Exactly.
So Havelock and Miller make it to sort of the police headquarters.
Yep.
They get a bit of a brief. Much like Holden, Miller finds himself put in charge of a small team. He actually sits out the more problematic elements. Like he tells Havelock, just don't come. We don't need an Earther.
That's harsh. But no, again, I feel bad for Havelock, because it is just like, he's just so not useful, despite whether he's a good cop or not, which I think Miller actually thinks that he probably is a good cop. He's just so not in the right place.
He's not a good cop on series.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, and then so they go to put on all their riot gear, and it's not there. So they're forced to put on the SWAT gear, like the killing outfits.
Yeah.
Which, of course is going to help calm everyone down.
Well, yeah. Like, when I first thought of this, I was like, oh, this is a cool beat of, like, things are going worse, again, even worse than you thought. But then I thought about it, and, like, the fact that there's clearly a political plot to start a war, potentially these missing riot suits are a piece of that. Like, if riots end up getting more violent than they normally would, and the police isn't able to as effectively prevent it, that would help along this war that is potentially being started. So I wonder whether this riot gear is like just a casualty of, I don't know, corruption or like whatever accidents that happen, or whether it's something more serious and it's like this is explicitly a beat in the chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think Miller quickly thinks in this chapter on like the governor and where the governor might stand in an OPA takeover.
Yeah.
So anyway, they head out in their like SWAT gear, kind of armed to the teeth. And they run into a crowd, in their patrol, who, all just stand and watch this OPA guy beat a woman to death for working for a Martian freighter.
That's a crime punishable by death, I reckon.
Because I think like it's never actually stated she's Martian or she's an Earther. I think it's kind of left hanging. She's a belter working for Martians.
Yeah, it's just the fact that she's wearing a uniform, possibly, that is enough to.
So, with some smooth words and a quick bullet to the murderer's kneecap, Miller kind of talks the crowd down.
Yeah.
And then arrests the man that, he had shot.
Yeah. It's great. Like, he does a really good job here. Like, 2 thumbs up to Miller. He manages this situation very, very well. It's interesting. Yeah, you kind of referred to Miller earlier as lawful neutral in our notes, right? And I love that. It's not even necessarily that it's following the law that he cares about, because it's not necessarily that people follow the law. What he cares about is that people don't rock the boat. Like, his prime directive seems to be maintain a calm, stable equilibrium, and anything that displaces that equilibrium is a problem, and so I need to correct it.
Yeah, I guess going back to that, it's a bit of a metaphor for the water and the air, right? Like, the belters need to keep their ecosystems very stable because, one thing in an air filter can cause everyone to suffocate. One problem person can stuff things up for everyone. I really like that way of looking at it. I also think like this whole ethos is just so perfectly captured by the words that he says to this guy as he's arresting him. He sort of looks down at this guy who's like whelping as his like kneecap is still bleeding.
Both knees, I think.
Yeah. And Miller says to him, "You are under arrest for the murder of that lady over there, whoever the hell she is. You are not required to participate in questioning without the presence of an attorney or union representative. And if you so much as look at me wrong, I'll space you." And I love how this speech begins kind of echoing the Miranda rights.
The Miranda rights,
are a bit of a trope from like, we all know them from movies and TV. The sort of, you have the right to remain silent, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And that's a very like official, lawful thing. And then he sort of devolves into, if you give me the wrong impression, I'm just going to kill you.
Yeah.
And it's just like, so it's like, he's going to follow the rules, but if you fuck with him, he'll just kill you.
Yeah, it starts out very official and kind of deteriorates as it goes, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's such a great encapsulation of just the way Miller is going to treat problems like this.
Yeah, definitely.
And so then we head into the final chapter that we're going to be covering today, chapter 7, from back in Holden's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
He's on the night, the crew's hanging out, and they're basically awaiting orders from the company that they work for, which is Pure and Clean Water Company, to figure out where they go from here. Because at the moment, they are right in the middle of Jupiter and the asteroid belt. So they're in like the middle of nowhere, about as far from anything as you can get. And now they just have to sit here and wait for orders from their corporate headquarters.
Yeah, and I was starting to question whether this was actually science fiction because it didn't have any anti-capitalist sentiment in it. But thank God we get some here, because otherwise it wouldn't be proper science fiction. Which is, of course, one of the reasons I love it as a genre so much.
Yeah, I mean, like, the horror of watching your crewmates die and like being stranded out in the middle of space, and really before you do anything, your main option is that you have
Let's
to
check
radio
the employee
into
handbook first.
HQ.
Yeah,
that's more horrifying than the flesh monster in the prologue.
Yeah,
but yeah, there's an interesting dream Holden has here that I wanted to call out. Where he sort of, it's like a half dream, I guess. It's as he's trying to use like a drug cocktail to go to sleep.
Yeah.
He thinks about like the Cant and how it was his home, and how he was probably going to spend many more years there. And it's interesting how this echoes with the conversation he had with Ade in chapter 1, where she was basically saying, "You're at home here," and he's like, "Oh, I could leave whenever I want," and now they're all dead, including Ade, and he's thinking on her, and then he's thinking, that was my home, and I was probably going to stay there, forever.
Yep, she was right the whole time. Yeah, I don't know. We get beats, like we get beats throughout this part of the chapter where people are criticizing his decision to send that out. And again, it just feels like he's a bit naive. But I do feel much more for him. Like, my heart opens up for him after the tragedy that he has just encountered.
Yeah, you can forgive him for not thinking straight at that point. Yeah, there is an interesting beat that kind of echoes what we saw between Holden and Havelock. Sorry, with Miller and Havelock. There was that, at the start of last chapter, there was the Belter versus Earther way of thinking. And we do kind of get that again where Naomi at one point is like, well, you did say that Mars blew it up. And he's like, no, I didn't. And she's like, yeah, you did.
You kind of did, right? Like,
Havelock said the same thing. Like, it's this different way of thinking. Like, the way Holden opened it up to all the Belters seems to have said, Mars attacked us, whereas, all the Earthers are sort of like, okay, so he thinks Mars might have been involved.
I don't know about that. Like, if his broadcast was, our ship was blown up, and here's all the Martian evidence that we saw that says that they did it, but I'm just going to let you make your own conclusions. Like, I don't know. That's not, like, yes, I'm sure the people who are, like, the most affected by this, like the political council on Mars and Earth and whatever, are going to be analyzing that a bit more than just trusting his word for it. But 95% of people will just be like, oh, Mars did it. Okay, cool. Let's react as though that is the case, because that's the impression that he has clearly presented.
Yeah, I agree. But yeah, so then there's this interesting bit where Holden starts to, you've already brought this up, he starts to actually think about, like, why would they have done this?
Yep, great. It's great that you think about this more now.
And just as he's starting to think about that, they get word back from the legal team of Pure and Clean, who basically, jump on the pile of people telling him that broadcast was a fucking dumb idea.
Yep.
And then they are told that they should wait to be picked up by the Martian Navy ship, the Donager, which will be coming over from Jupiter, basically pick them up for some more questioning. The team, who do themselves believe that Mars is the one who did it,
yes,
as you'd expect, kind of unimpressed with the idea of being handed to the Martian Navy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they come up with a sneaky plan to make sure that they aren't just disappeared and tortured.
Yeah, which is the old James Holden special. Send out a broadcast.
It's pretty great.
He's basically a Twitch streamer, right? He's just like live streaming his life. Or Justin.tv, I guess, not Twitch. But yeah, I don't know. Obviously the first broadcast was a mistake for so many reasons. This one I'm a bit more on board with. Like, they're in such a terrible position. They clearly have nothing to do. So he's kind of like just fucking them over if they kill him, which, yeah. Fair enough. It's kind of a thing that will implicate Mars no matter what, because like, what Amos thinks is going to happen next is they're just going to force him to retract his statement by torturing him. And there's no way for people to not immediately think that will happen, even if Mars is like, oh, no, it wasn't us, and we're super sorry, and here, like, we'll pay reparations and shit. And they treat them perfectly. And Holden's like, oh, okay, I better put out a statement that says that Mars is actually super chill. People are obviously going to be like, well, we can't trust that. Like, no matter what, he's painted them into a corner. It's a bit too late. So a bit of a lose-lose, but I guess it's their best option. I don't know.
It's a good one for keeping them alive, in theory.
Yeah.
Maybe not for fixing the broader situation, but for keeping them alive, it's probably a smart play.
Yeah.
But yeah, so after broadcasting these plans to everyone that they're going to go with the Donager and, they're fine with it, Alex pipes up because he's keeping an eye on the situation, and he notes that 6 small ships have just reappeared and are burning very hard towards them.
Yeah, but not the same ships. Like, it's kind of explicitly confirmed these aren't the same 6 ships, right?
No. No, I mean, he doesn't say they're the 6 same ships. But they are going to arrive at their location 2 days before the Donager.
Yeah. And
James just looks at them and says, so who the fuck are you? And that's where we're leaving off today.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the fact that there are 6 ships is interesting. It obviously matches the 6 that were there before, which is a little bit dangerous. I don't know. I don't think it's the same ships. I just got the sense that it wasn't. I'm kind of looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, we've already got Mars and the Belt kind of explicitly tied into this. The other faction that we haven't seen yet is Earth, so maybe it's 6 Earth ships and that's something, or maybe it's like more explicitly tying in the OPA, I'm not sure, but I get the sense that this book series is about a war brewing between these factions, and so let's just tie all the factions in early off,
Yeah, make it a hot mess from the start.
Set it up nice and messy.
So I suppose we'll have to wait and find out if this show gets picked up for season.
Mm-hmm.
But before we go, I just wanted to do a bit of a bonus bit.
Whoa.
So bonus bits are something we did in Deep Impact, and if we go on with this one, I had some ideas for bonus bits relating to the science of the Expanse, because I find the realism so much fun to play with in the Expanse.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk about a bit of it. Yeah. So
cool. Take us through it. What are we talking about?
So today, I wanted to talk about spinning up an asteroid, because obviously, we learned Miller lives on Ceres, which is an actual, real asteroid.
Oh, okay, cool.
In the asteroid belt. And, so it's set up in the book that it was spun up so that people could live on it. And I guess I just wanted to go through the science of how that might work.
Yeah. Is it possible?
Yes, so it's an interesting question. Ceres is actually the biggest asteroid in the asteroid belt. That's a fun fact. It's technically a dwarf planet. In fact, it was considered a planet at one time, but it's below Pluto, but it's getting there. In fact, it's the only asteroid in the asteroid belt that is like spherical due to its own gravity. Like, it's the only asteroid that's gravity is strong enough to like force it into a spherical shape.
Yeah.
It's about like 1,000 kilometers, or if you live in a one of those countries that uses miles, 600 miles. So it kind of makes sense that they target it first because it's one of the biggest ones. Yeah. So basically, the way the way gravity works on things like Ceres, especially in the Expanse, is you do spin gravity, which is kind of the opposite. So here on Earth, gravity pushes us in, and that's just basically all the mass of the Earth like sucking us down. Spin gravity is like the opposite. With spin gravity, you spin something, and that's pushing you outwards. So, like in a spin gravity situation like Ceres, you're actually standing inside the sphere, and you're being pushed outwards, away from it.
Yeah.
So in the series, it said that series, that was terrible phrasing. In the books, it's
in the series or in the series.
Sorry, I meant in the book series,
right?
Series the station. I'm going to stop using the word series in terms of in the books.
Yeah.
Series station has a gravity of about 0.3 g, like 1 g being what we have on Earth.
Yeah.
So the real life asteroid has a gravity of 0.03. So basically, the spin gravity is like 10 times what its natural gravity would be.
Yeah.
And 0.
Well,
0.3,
it would have to be 11 times, right, to counteract.
Well, yeah, exactly.
The first time as well.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
Math.
It's actually fun fact. Because the book talks a lot about how belters grow up differently. There's been a few references to Luna, like the Earth Moon, and some people live and work there.
Yeah.
The Moon actually has a gravity of about 0.17 g, so it's like actually about half as much as Ceres. So Ceres in the books actually has twice as much gravity for growing up than people get on the Moon. Which is interesting considering that a lot of the bigoted stuff directed at inners tends to go towards people from Luna as well. Kind of proving that it is much more a class thing than a physical thing. But yeah, so basically, to talk about spinning up the asteroid, you've got this rock, Ceres, and basically you want to spin it up, but the problem you're going to run into is, as you start to spin it and things are accelerating outwards, you're going to hit what's called the Roche limit, which is essentially that point where things are getting pushed out more than they're getting pushed in, to the point where they just start to break off. So that's a factor of like how much things are being pushed in, but also like how strong the asteroid is. If the asteroid's made out of sand versus like one solid rock, it's got a much higher Roche limit because it's going to stay together longer.
Yeah. So would Ceres be able to spin that fast without breaking apart?
Not in its current state, because it is about 60% various rocks and minerals and about like 30 to 40% water. Ice out there. Yeah. But basically, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on there that basically is like, pretty much no naturally occurring thing is probably going to hit that 11x that we talked about spin and not just start to break apart.
Yeah.
And so, they do say in the books that, Tycho had spent an entire generation figuring out how to do this. So, I saw some talk online about like what you could do to make this more possible. And there's stuff about, melting the surface so the outer shell has a high Roche limit and hoping that's enough to keep the middle in place. Putting support structures through it all. Most people seem to think it would actually just be easier to just build those metal supports, like kind of set up a mining station on Ceres and use that to build the actual station that spins and everyone lives on, rather than hollowing out the actual asteroid. But yeah, at least it's kind of like, it's one of those points where the science is real enough to the point where you say, okay, this is maybe all possible. I think somebody actually did the math on how much thrust Epstein drives generate,
right?
Based on details later, and they said it was like 200 Epstein drives for 10 years would be able to spin Ceres enough.
Interesting. Okay.
So like it's sort of all there. The questions in real life about whether it's actually the best way to build a station like this.
Yeah.
But
it is feasibly possible, plausible.
Perhaps yes is sort of the result.
I just want you to tell me which stamp with the Mythbusters stamp on it if they did an episode on it.
If I had to give it one, I'd probably say no.
You'd give it a busted. I mean,
I
busted.
would.
Oof,
but it is much more fun as a setting. So like I'll give it the what is it, poetic license waiver.
You got to either stamp with, I think, plausible or busted, Elliot. It's got to be one or the other.
I'll have to give it busted, unfortunately. Unless we get more details about what Tycho did for that generation that they were working. It seems unlikely.
Well, if it's busted, I guess we might as well just stop the pilot here. We're not going to continue this on. I'm sorry, unrealistic. Can't carry it on.
Bad one to start. I just quickly, like, a fun fact about spin gravity that I wanted to bring up, and the books sort of touch on it, but it's probably not clear to most people. When you're in spin-based gravity, the thing about, like, gravity of that form is it's the thrust that you're getting outwards depends on how far away you are from the center.
Yes.
So, like, if you're like, in, you know, so series, Miller constantly talks about how many levels there are.
Yeah.
If you're on one of the upper levels, which is closer to the middle of the station, there's actually less gravity than there is on the lower levels, which is like where all the ships are taking off and stuff. And that's all to do with, like, centrifugal forces and stuff. But it also, as you're getting closer to the center, the change, you know, is proportionally higher. Right, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like when you're on one of those very high upper levels, the difference in the gravity felt by your feet and your head is like potentially actually noticeably different.
Wow.
And Miller touches on this. He calls it the Coriolis effect, which you know, has like a different meaning here, but you can see why it is called the Coriolis force in physics. So you can see why, you know, the Belters would move it
language, yeah.
But yeah, so the Coriolis, like, in those higher levels, is to the point where your feet and your head, when you're standing up, have different amounts of gravity to the point where you feel it tugging at you like sideways.
That's so weird.
And that's why Miller actually starts to feel sick up there. And I think he says Havoc's dealing with it even worse than he was.
Yeah.
And that's why those upper levels are kind of the where the poorer neighborhoods on series, because nobody wants to live up there. So that's like that's the sort of side effect of living in spin gravity. And there's, you know, there's all sorts of information online if you're interested on, like, how big a spin station needs to be before the Coriolis forces won't be upsetting for people trying to live in it. It's like a couple of hundred meters at least from the sounds of it. Yeah.
Interesting. Damn.
Yeah. So that's just some fun spin gravity facts for you in this bonus bit.
Science faction, we call that.
Oh god, that is the name of that bit from now on. That's too good. Where were you a few hours ago when I was writing the script, Reuben? But yeah, that's all we have for you today on Milowda ARD Expanse.
Yeah.
If you like this pilot, let us know through the Google form.
Yep.
Because that's what we're using to figure out where we go once Pale Reflections, our current show, finishes up.
Yeah, that form lets you rate the shows and let us know what you thought of them, tell us anything you'd like to change or keep the same, all that good stuff. Of course, you can also get onto the Doof Media Patron Discord and leave us your thoughts there in the hashtag pilot-season channel.
Yes. So, you know, becoming a patron gets you all sorts of great benefits. There's tons of stuff on the Doof Network. Go check it out. You get to vote and tons of things, and it's a lot of fun. The Discord's great. There's, you know, so many other shows on the Doof Network worth checking out as well. Not to toot our own horns, but Pale Reflection just started. I think it's going okay so far.
Go check it out. Yeah, the first episode I thought was pretty good, and there'll be another one every week.
Yes, and Pale itself is very good, so you should read that, even if you don't listen to Pale Reflections.
If you're listening to this, you probably already are on the same feed with Pale Reflections, so you're probably in a good spot.
That's a good point. I forgot about that. Yes, it's already here. And if you're listening to this and you're still here and you're wondering why we're not talking about Pale until right now, an hour and a half in, this is almost the last pilot season, so it'll just be Pale Reflection stuff after this, I promise.
We have one more pilot to get to, which is next week. We are doing the Doof Media Variety Show, which is a live spectacular where we have dial-in guests, we have special guests from across Doof. We'll be playing games, we'll be doing all kinds of cool hangouts. If you want, you can call in and potentially win a game if you win a game against one of our special guests and win a prize. So, if you want more info on that, head to the Discord because it's all in there, and or stay tuned, I guess. And actually, maybe we'll post the form that lets you sign up to be a call-in guest as well, so you don't have to be a patron to sign up.
Yeah, we'll put that in the link. We'll put that link in the show notes below. That thing's very much Reuben's baby. I'm looking forward to it. I'm helping out a bit, but
the producer,
some of the
Elliot.
stuff. Yeah, it's one of those like executive producer things where it's mostly just, you know, because I was there. I'm going to be helping out a bit on the day, but Reuben's put all the work into planning this, and like looking at what we've got planned, it's going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait. Reuben's killing it.
Yeah.
So really come and check it out if you can.
Yep.
The guests we've got lined up are great as well.
Yeah, we have Elise Daly from What You Say on the Doof Media Network, and her husband Scott Daly, also from some other shows on the Doof Media Network, who will be tuning in. So come and check it out. It'll be a good time.
Yeah. And so on that note, we're going to finish this pilot, as we always do, with Reuben's sign-off phrase.
Yep. Oh, fuck. You really flipped it around on me. My classic sign-off, which is stay frosty, ice haulers.
Nice.
See ya. Oh, why didn't I expect that?